Starfleet Battles. It is a space starship combat game based on Star Trek. The game originated in 1975 and has grown since then. You can purchase Starfleet Battles at starfleetgames.com. Just go to their Order Products button. Today we are going to look at New Worlds number 1. It's an expansion module. It adds foes, allies, the far side of the Klingon frontier. Lyrans are cunning allies for the Empire of Steel and relentless foes of the Zintis. And that's who we're going to look at today as the Lyran, specifically the expanding sphere generator. I'm not going to go into the entire set of rules, but I'm going to go into a brief subsection here. So G23513. ESGs do not negate shields or armor. Damage from an ESG is scored on the target's shield, which is facing the ship generating that ESG. This is judged by the same procedures as direct fire weapons, D3.4, unless the line of fire falls exactly along the shield boundary, in which case score the damage on the shield, which was facing the ESG hex, which the other ship entered, or the ESG hex, which entered the same hex as the other ship. If the ESG ship and the other ship move on the same impulse, judge the situation by whichever ship moved first. If both moved at exactly the same time, all tiebreakers in C1.313 being exhausted, the ESG interaction is judged as if the other ship had moved first. That's one small little paragraph, but it contains an awful lot. So we'll briefly look at C1.313. It's the order of precedence. Basically, it tells you in what order things move. Monsters, ships, nimble ships, fighters and shuttles, then seeking weapons. Bases rotate. Ships make tactical maneuvers. Nimble ships make tactical maneuvers. Fighters make tactical maneuvers. That's the order in which things move in the order of precedence. Now a brief look at D3.4. Now, 3.4 is the entire section on determining which shield was struck by enemy fire. Well, the relevant section really is this little bit right here. Direct fire weapons. For direct fire weapons, the line of fire must be determined. To do this, simply draw an imaginary line from the center of the target ship's hex to the center of the firing ship's hex, and determine which shield is crossed. And here it gives you an example. A ship in 202 is attacked by a ship in 305. A line from 305 to 202 crosses the hex side, separating hex 202 from hex 203. Therefore, it is the rear number 4 shield which takes the damage. This line right here is basically the shield boundary between shield number 3 and shield number 4. So in a situation like this, let's say the Zinti moves. It moves into this hex. Which shield got struck by the ESG? The Zinti's number 1 or the Zinti's number 6? So again, the rule was damage from an ESG is scored on the target's shield, which is facing the ship generating that ESG. So the Lyran in 1005 is generating the ESG and it's facing the Zinti. So this would imply that it would be the number 6 shield that was struck. Now this is why this ESG rule is a bit annoying to a lot of players, is that it seems to be a little bit counterintuitive. You would think that a ship moving from 1103 to 1003 would take the damage on its number 1 shield, as it's moving from a non-ESG hex into an ESG hex. But the thing is, it's not a solid sphere. That radius is, according to the way the rules description works, is a detection radius. So once the field detects targets in the appropriate radius, it then releases the energy and strikes the ship. Now, if the ESG ship and the other ship move on the same impulse, judge the situation by whichever ship moved first. So let's say here, the Zinti turns and moves, and the Lyran goes forward. So, would it be the Zinti's number 5 shield that gets hit? Well, it would depend on the order of precedence. Which ship moves first? So if we go through that order of precedence, and everything comes out equal, it's judged as if the other ship had moved first, which would mean the Zinti, which would mean it would be the number 5 shield that got hit. But if it was the Lyran that moved first, it would be the Zinti's number 6 shield, and here's why. The damage caused by the ESG field is scored at the designated point during the movement segment as a separate volley. So here, if the Lyran moves first and then the Zinti moves, the Lyran would strike the number 6 shield on the Zinti, and then the Zinti moves and turns and ends up presenting a new shield. So now the Zinti, even though he's been struck on his number 6 shield and it's down, it has an up number 5 shield towards the Lyran. Now there is an exception. If the other ship, in this case the Zinti, is inside the ESG shield, or sphere, and moving out of it, or the ESG is dragged over it, the shield struck would be the one opposite, the one facing the ship generating the ESG. So they've gone from it not being a solid sphere to suddenly it kind of being a solid sphere. But not really. It's still being judged by the field detecting the movement and then zapping and solidifying at that distance. So here the Zinti is moving into the field detects it, raises the sphere, and it hits the shield. So it would be the shield opposite. In this case, it would be shield 1, or it would be shield 2. Well, let's say the Lyran didn't move. So that means that the Zinti had moved. So it would be the number 1 getting struck. Now things get even more fun, because multiple targets can hit the shield, or the sphere I should say. I'm sorry, I keep saying shield, the expanding sphere. So if 2 or more objects enter the field simultaneously, damage is caused to and by the ESG field in the following priority. Units which move completely through the field, unless both are generating an ESG, in which case priority 2 is resolved first. And then it gives an example. So here in the example in the rule book, There's a field in 404. The generating ship is in 401. And the drone targeted on the ship is in 405. Both the ship and the drone move in this impulse. So the drone would move to 404. And the field to 405. So the drone passes through the field. Now let's say that the strength of the ESG was weak, and that was an armored double-spaced drone or something that had more points than the ESG field. So here, this drone would go through the field, drop the ESG, and the other drone wouldn't take any damage. Now I have another section of the rule, movement of the generating ship. Movement of the ship that is generating the ESG in such a way as to cause the ESG field to contact another unit has the same effect as the movement of that unit. That is, the unit is damaged. Note that it is possible for a target unit and the ship generating the ESG to move toward each other on the same impulse. In this case, the damage is still resolved normally. The target cannot jump across the field unharmed, but the sequence of play must be interrupted to determine which ship moves first, move that ship, determine the ESG damage immediately, resolving it at the appropriate point, then move the other ship and continue the normal sequence of play. And we have an example. So the example reads, the Lyran CA is in hex 1010 facing A, projecting the ESG field into 10-7 among others, while a Hydron frigate is in 10-6, here we'll use a Zinti counter, facing D. Both ships are scheduled to move straight ahead. So this would go here, and this would go here. It could be argued that the frigate, in this case a Zinti, and the ESG passed, and there was no contact. But this is obviously illogical, and the situation is resolved by the above rule. The same situation can occur when the ships are moving apart, in which case it is resolved the same way. In other words, you interrupt the sequence of play at the point the ESG strikes the ship, resolve the damage, finish movement. Now there is another case or exception. Note also that if the ESG ship is moving in the same impulse as its target, but has moved first in that impulse, and the subsequent and same impulse movement of the target moves the ship clear of the field, but not across it, no contact with the field took place. So here, if the Lyran moves first, it would appear that the ESG is going to strike the Zinti, but on the same impulse movement, the Zinti also moves. So the Lyran would move. It would look like the Zinti gets hit, but the Zinti also moves that impulse and moves forward. So in this situation, the field didn't quite catch up to the Zinti, and no contact occurs. So it does matter that at the end of movement, the target is either in the ESG hex or has crossed the field in order for damage to have occurred. Now it's a little bit different if the Zinti is actually in the ESG field hex. So if the Lyran and the Zinti both move, it's going to end up looking exactly the same, but one hex up farther. So the Lyran and the Zinti are the same distance. The Zinti had moved out of the ESG hex, but then when the Lyran moves, it's in the ESG hex again because it's ending its turn in an ESG hex, it gets hit. And this is true even if the two units are linked by a tractor beam from the Lyran ESG generating ship, unless the generating ESG ship tractor voluntarily decides to treat the matter under 5732. And 5732, it's the opposite around. If they are linked by a tractor beam from the target, in other words a Zinti in this case, the potential target is using the beam to avoid contact. So basically, if these two ships are held together by a tractor beam, and it's the Lyran doing the holding, and it's the Zinti that's held, basically when the Lyran moves forward, it lets the tractor beam slip a little bit and get just a little bit closer so that the field contacts the Zinti. And it's the opposite around. If the Zinti is maintaining the distance, the tractor is keeping him from being struck. This is just to take into effect that one hex is a very large area of space, and that the tractor beam was established keeping the Zinti outside of the field. So the ESG system doesn't really detect the movement of the target within the field or into the field, so it doesn't trigger. It's a bit complex. They could have just simply eliminated all that and allowed the field to strike, but they tried to do a little bit of realism with the rule here. And because of that, it makes it a little bit more complex to know the rules, but logically, it works out. If both ships are generating a tractor beam, each will make its own decision as to which of the two above cases will be used. Made secretly, announced simultaneously. If there is a disagreement, the potential target, in other words a Zinti, makes the decision. They do try and take into account all scenarios and possibilities. Note that a larger ship could rotate a smaller unit into its field, and a smaller ship could rotate itself to effectively move its field into contact in the tractor rotation step of a turn, assuming they had maintained tractor links. The damage would not be resolved until the ESG step of the damage during movement stage of the movement segment of the first impulse of that turn. That's because G7.7 is over a turn break. You can perform a tractor rotation. And since the damage is happening between impulse 32 and impulse 1, the damage is applied during the movement of impulse 1. Tractor rotations are one of those, I would call a mistake in the rules, but it's the way they've written them. For instance, I could tractor beam an opponent ship on impulse 1 of a turn, and from impulse 1 to impulse 32, I'm not able to do a tractor rotation. But if I hold that tractor over the turn from 32 to 1, I can perform a tractor rotation. So that's 32 impulses of not being able to do anything in terms of tractor rotations, but on impulse 32 I can do one. The other example is that if I establish that tractor beam on impulse 29, or 30, or 31, or 32, and maintain it from 32 to 1, I can do a tractor rotation right then and there on that 32 to 1 break. The tractor rotation itself really isn't based on the amount of time the ship has been held in a tractor. Rather, it's based on the turn break being the point where ships reallocate their energy, which is a bit of a kludge of a game mechanic. Like I said, I would consider it to be a mistake to do the rules that way, but it's just the way that it's worked out over time. Personally, I would rather have it be that you can perform a tractor rotation after 8 impulses, or 16 impulses, or 24 impulses, or 32 impulses, a set amount of time, rather than something that just happens over a turn break. But I didn't write the rules. That's the way it goes. On with the ESG stuff. Now the next rule is basically saying that rotating a ship by tactical maneuvers doesn't incur damage. So turns without changing hexes by the generating ship do not result in damage to units in ESG hexes. Turns without changing hexes, in other words tactical maneuvers, they wrote that badly, by units in ESG hexes do not result in damage to those units. The ESG field itself does not rotate as the ship turns, so it cannot damage enemy units in ESG hexes like a disc sander. So in this situation, if both ships are going speed 0 and the Lyran rotates by tactical maneuver, it doesn't cause damage to the Zinti. Okay, now in an earlier example I showed the Zinti moving into the ESG hex here, and I may have done a mental flub here. So which shield gets struck in this situation? Well, it's not because the Zinti moved and the Lyran didn't. You actually look at the next impulse. So it's the same situation as a shield boundary. So you examine the impulse chart, determine which ship is scheduled to move next by the order of precedence. So if the Lyran moves next, it would be the Zinti's number 1 that got struck. If the Zinti were to move next, it's still the Zinti's number 1 that gets struck. Now, what if it had been a side slip? By that movement alone, it looks like it is the number 6 that gets hit. But is it? Because if the Lyran moves next, it would put it off the Zinti's number 3, which would indeed mean it is the number 6. If the Zinti moves next, it would be judging it as hitting the number 4 shield in the firing situation. So despite it was a side slip, despite the fact that it was a side slip, it would actually be the number 1 of the Zinti that got hit. Because it's judged by direct fire. So if the Zinti had moved forward, it's the number 4 getting hit, therefore it's the number 1 that got hit because it's moving out of the ESG field. So even though ESGs are a pretty small section of rules, they get complex because they deal with movement, multiple targets, tractor beams, mines, drones, fighters, etc. And then you get shield boundaries, order of precedence of movement. We didn't even get into Tholian webs and stasis field generators or hellbores. So there are multiple interactions when it comes to ESGs. Pretty simple concept, just an energy sphere that does damage to things. But then when you start plugging in all the other rules, things get a little bit more complex. Especially considering the fact that it's based on movement. Now, if I were to wave a magic wand and rewrite the rules, I would have based the ESG as an almost direct fire weapon that happens after movement, after launching of seeking weapons. But before fire. So if at that point of the sequence something was within the radius to be damaged, it then would expand out from the ship and then hit those targets. But that would completely change the rule, because the way the rules are written now, the ESGs are hollow and they sort of solidify at that radius. They don't expand out from the ship, and it would complicate fleet movements enormously. But it would reduce most of the rules interactions. But it would complicate the use of the ESG for the Lyran player to such a degree that nobody would ever want to use it. So by having the more complex rule interactions with movement, multiple targets, etc., it actually, believe it or not, makes it easier for the Lyran to use. Just imagine 4 or 5 Lyran ships all within range 2 or 3 of one another. They've got drones on the board, they've got shuttles on the board, they've got PFs on the board, and they try and use an ESG, they'd be hitting their own ships, their own drones, their own shuttles, their own PFs, and each other, and each other's ESGs, if it were to be based sort of like almost a direct fire weapon that literally expanded from the ship. So even though the rules as they're written are a little bit more complex, it makes it easier for the Lyran to use. So that's it for Module C1, the one particular race that we looked at, the Lyrans and their ESG system. Again, you can get Starfleet games at starfleetgames.com, Starfleet Battles, Federation Empire, Federation Commander, etc. Have fun playing Starfleet Battles. Have a good day. Click like if you like the video, share it on social media.